Gary sat at the kitchen table, holding his coffee mug as he watched Ruth move around the house. From the outside it looked like any other morning for a married couple of 10 years, but inside, Gary felt a growing unease. After months of building routines that once felt reassuring, Ruth's morning rituals now seemed dull and empty. As she stood in front of the mirror applying her makeup with deliberate strokes, Gary couldn't help but notice a shift in her. Her eyes had a new, detached look that he couldn't ignore. They'd met in their mid. They were both in their 22s, full of dreams and ambition. Gary had been on a fast track in the tech world, while Ruth had her own ambitious start in marketing. Their relationship had been fiery and full of life back then, marked by late-night talks about the future, spur-of-the-moment road trips and a shared thirst for adventure. But as time passed, life settled into something familiar. Gary's career surged forward, consuming more of his focus while Ruth seemed to drift, searching for a sense of fulfillment she hadn't found. The thrill that once brought them together had faded, leaving behind a comfortable, predictable routine. Over the past year, Ruth had been going out more often, meeting new people through work events and social gatherings. Gary had never questioned her independence. He trusted her completely. But lately, something felt off. Her nights out were more frequent, and even when she was home, her mind seemed elsewhere. His phone buzzed on the table, yanking him out of his thoughts. It was a text from a colleague reminding him about a meeting. He let out a quiet sigh, setting the phone aside and taking another slow sip of coffee. Today, he didn't feel like going to work. What he wanted was to sit. He decided to have a chat with Ruth and find out what was going on between them. But he knew that wasn't going to happen today. As she was finishing her makeup, she glanced at him through the mirror and said, "I'm going out with some friends tonight." Her tone was light and casual, as though she were talking about any routine outing. But to Gary, her words carried a strange weight. He asked again, trying to keep his voice even. He didn't want to sound suspicious, but he couldn't help feeling there was more to her outings than she was saying. Ruth's hand paused midair, her fingers resting on her makeup. "Brush. It's just a small gathering. I'll be back later tonight." Gary managed a nod and a thin smile, though he had a million questions he didn't dare ask. Who were these friends? Why hadn't he met them? And why did she always go without him? His mind reeled, but he held his instead. He pushed back his chair, put his empty coffee cup in the sink and said, "Okay, I'll see you later." He picked up his briefcase and walked to the door, pausing to glance back at her. Ruth was already back in her own world, entirely absorbed in her reflection outside. The morning air struck him, and he took a steadying breath, trying to shake off the sense of dread building in his chest. Today felt different. It felt like it held the weight of a change neither of them could avoid. It was a Friday morning, just like countless others in their years together, yet the air was thick with something he couldn't name. The tension that had been simmering inside him now felt impossible to ignore as he watched her get ready. She moved with a lightness he hadn't seen in a long time, slipping on a dress he'd never seen before. It was one that fit her so perfectly it seemed she'd chosen it. It was for a special occasion. Gary's stomach twisted and he wanted to say something, but he wasn't sure how. How do you ask someone why they seem so far away without sounding insecure? How do you say that the trust you once had feels fragile, as if it could shatter at the slightest touch? Ruth continued. Gary noticed that Ruth seemed unaware of his gaze for a moment. He saw her as someone unfamiliar, like a stranger with a life outside the one they shared. She had always been beautiful, effortlessly so, but now, standing there in front of the mirror, she looked like a version of herself that he no longer recognized. He suddenly realized the weight of it and knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice betraying the calm he was trying to maintain. Ruth froze, her hands still midair with the brush, and looked at him through the mirror, her face unreadable. Ruth said softly, "I'm going out of town with some friends." Gary stared at her, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "Out of town?" he echoed, his mind buzzing with questions he didn't quite know how to ask. He wanted to know how long she was planning to be gone. He was still shocked. Friends, new friends. He'd never heard of them. Just for 3 days, she replied, turning to face him but keeping her gaze lowered. Her eyes flickered briefly to the floor before shifting back to her reflection in the mirror, as if it offered her reassurance. Gary was reassured by her tone, but his stomach was in knots. He got up from the sofa, and the tension between them was palpable. 3 days, he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. You just now thought to tell me? The conversation itself was an inconvenience. This came up at the last minute. Gary, I didn't think it would be that big of a deal. I just need a break sometimes to be around new people and to relax. She waved a hand as if brushing away his concerns as though they were nothing. A surge of anger and frustration, Gary's fists clenched involuntarily at his sides. So I'm not important enough for you to tell me about your plans? You just thought you'd disappear for a few days without saying a word? Ruth turned toward him fully, her expression hardening. It's not like that, Gary. I didn't think you'd care. You're so wrapped up in your work all the time that I figured it wouldn't make a difference if I took a few days to myself. Her words landed hard, cutting deep. Gary held back a biting response, knowing this was about more than a few days away. He took a breath, then spoke with a firm resolve. Gary was determined to get to the bottom of things. He told Ruth that if she left without telling him what was going on, it would be the end of their relationship. Ruth paused at the door, and for a moment, Gary thought she might turn back or try to explain. She let out a small sigh. I need this, Gary. I'll explain everything when I get back. Without looking at him again, she opened the door and stepped out. The finality of the door clicking shut echoed through the quiet room, closing a chapter. Gary wasn't sure if it would ever reopen. He stood there, frozen, staring at the empty doorway. He felt blindsided. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. How had they reached this point? How had he missed all the signs? He slowly sank back onto the sofa, feeling numb and heavy. The house suddenly felt empty, as if the warmth of their shared life had evaporated. Outside, Ruth walked down the street, the cool air brushing her face, but doing little to soothe her nerves. Her thoughts raced, guilt and dread gnawing at her. She had been avoiding this conversation for weeks, knowing Gary deserved answers, but she wasn't sure she had them. How could she tell him that she felt as if something fundamental was missing, that the life they'd created felt stifling? Gary had been a good husband, steady and dependable, always providing without complaint. But their life had become a felt trapped in each day, a mirror of the last. The spontaneity and passion they once had seemed like a distant memory. She'd met Vincent at a work function months ago. At first it had been nothing but polite conversation and harmless laughs. But as they kept talking, their connection grew deeper, and the chemistry between them became impossible to ignore. Vincent had something Gary didn't, an impulsiveness and energy that drew her in with him. She felt alive again, like she could breathe without restrictions. But it wasn't just the excitement of something new when she was with Vincent. She didn't feel the weight of expectations or the need to fit into a role. She could just be herself, unfiltered and free, as she approached the car that would take her to him. Her heart raced with a mix of thrill and fear. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the thought of slipping back into her the next 3 days were a bit of a struggle. She was used to a routine life with Gary, but she craved a taste of freedom and a chance to be someone other than the person she'd become. But there was a voice in her mind that was a bit skeptical. What would happen when she came back? Would Gary forgive her? Had she already gone too far? She pushed those worries away as she climbed into the car. She couldn't afford to think about the aftermath just yet. For now, she was stepping out of her old life, leaving everything familiar behind. Whatever happened when she returned, she'd have to deal with it then. That'll have to wait for another day. Inside the house, Gary sat in silence, staring at the walls that now seemed to close in on him as the hours crawled by. Gary's mind churned, replaying the morning's conversation with Ruth on an endless loop. The woman he'd loved for 10 years had walked out. He had no idea if she'd ever come back. The sunlight was filtering through the casting long shadows across the floor. Gary barely noticed, though. His eyes were fixed on a business card sitting on the table. It was for a divorce lawyer he'd kept for weeks, hoping he'd never need it. The longer he sat there, the more he realized that if Ruth didn't come back, or if she did and nothing had changed, he knew what he'd have to do. He sank back onto the sofa and tried to calm his racing thoughts, but the silence only made it worse. He kept replaying the events, trying to find some rational explanation, but all he felt was a deep growing sense of Ruth's sudden trip, her defensive tone, the secrecy. It didn't sit right. The suspicion that it started as a seed now grew like wildfire, filling his thoughts with troubling possibilities. It wasn't that Ruth had never gone out on her own before. Over the years, she had her own friends and hobbies, her own space. But something about her behavior this morning, the evasion, the tension, it felt completely out of character. Or maybe he was just being paranoid. He'd always thought of Ruth as a reliable person, but this morning she'd seemed different. Gary glanced at his phone, debating whether to reach out, but what would be the point? She'd already left without any intention of explaining herself until she returned. That decision to leave him in the dark hurt more than any words could. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Gary opened his laptop. It was a desperate move, but he needed answers. He'd never have thought he'd do this, but he needed answers. He logged into their shared phone account. His hands shook a little as he found her recent call and text logs. He'd always respected her privacy, but today's suspicion outweighed respect. What he found made his stomach lurch. Over the past few weeks there were countless calls and texts to a number he didn't recognize. The frequency was alarming. Late-night messages. Long phone calls. Calls during times when she'd said she was working or out with friends. His heart pounded as he scrolled through the messages. Most were innocuous, but then he saw one that felt like a punch to the gut. "I can't wait to see you this weekend, 3 days alone together." Finally Gary's vision blurred as he stared at the screen. The message had been sent just 2 days ago and the sender's name was Vincent. His worst fears crystallized in an instant. Ruth. Gary was flooded with a rush of emotions. Anger. Sadness. Disbelief. But betrayal was the overwhelming feeling. How long had this been going on? How had he not seen it for years? He'd trusted her, given her the space she needed while he focused on building a future for them. In return she'd been meeting another man behind his back. The initial shock had given way to a quiet seething rage. Gary wasn't a vengeful person by nature, but he felt an urge for some kind of reckoning. He felt like he needed to get it all out. He'd poured his heart and a decade of his life into their marriage, and she'd thrown it away for a man he'd never met. The phone felt heavy in his hand, like it had just delivered a blow that shattered his entire world. He wanted to call Ruth and confront her, demand an explanation, but he knew she wouldn't be honest. Not yet. If he wanted the full truth, he needed to wait and gather more. The next day Gary found himself parked outside a small cafe in the city center, the one Ruth had mentioned as a regular meeting place with her friends. He sat in his car, eyes fixed on the entrance, feeling desperate, and even a little foolish. But he needed to know if she was truly with Vincent. Hours dragged by and just as he was about to give up he saw her. Ruth stepped out of the cafe laughing, her arm linked with a man he didn't recognize. He was tall and well-dressed and exuding confidence. Ruth seemed to radiate a kind of ease that made Gary feel uneasy. This had to be Vincent. His heart pounded as he watched them walk, seemingly unaware of his presence. They looked comfortable, maybe even happy together. Vincent's hand rested on the small of her back, guiding her as they talked. Ruth smiled at him, a warm, open smile. Gary hadn't seen that smile in years. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't about to sit idly by while Ruth threw away their marriage for someone else. If she was willing to break they'd made promises, so he wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. Over the next few days Gary gathered information and prepared for a confrontation. The betrayal had shifted something inside him. He'd once believed they'd face anything together, but that trust had been shattered. Now, he would be the one to take control of what came next. Whatever path lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: Ruth's choices had set them on a course they couldn't turn back from, and he was ready. To face whatever came next, Gary came up with a plan to take back control and close this chapter on his own terms. Confronting Ruth Hayden felt pointless. She had already made her choice, but he could still protect himself, reclaim his life, and leave her feeling the impact of what she'd done. He started with their finances. Gary had always managed their money, so he knew just what to do. He began transferring funds from their joint account into his private savings. A few clicks and Ruth's credit cards were canceled. He made sure that when she next tried to use them, she'd feel the consequences. Then he gathered every piece of evidence he'd collected: texts, call logs and photos of her with Vincent, and stored it all neatly so he'd have it ready to secure a clear, unchallenged divorce. His final move was cold, but necessary. He knew Ruth would twist the truth if he confronted her, or try to explain or downplay her actions, or even manipulate his emotions. Instead, he would let her face the reality of her actions alone when she returned from her 3-day getaway. On his way out for the day, Gary left a letter on the kitchen counter. Ruth found it when she came home from her 3-day trip. She read it, and her heart sank. She knew what it meant. "I've been speaking to a lawyer for a while now, and I'm expecting divorce papers to arrive soon. I've restricted access to our accounts, which seems fair given what's happened in the last few months. I deserve better. I'm leaving. Good luck with Vincent. I hope he's worth it." Ruth trembled and dropped the letter, staring into the empty house as the truth settled over her. Gary had found out, and was gone. For a moment she considered calling him, trying to take it back, but she knew it was too late. The weight of her choices hit her with full force. She destroyed her marriage, and there was no going back. In the days after he left, Gary went through a whirlwind of emotions: anger, relief, even sadness. He felt a strange sense of freedom, but it came with a hollow ache. He had loved her once deeply, and part of him always would, but that connection had been cut, severed by the betrayal. Now he had to rebuild and start over without her. He rented a modest apartment across town, far from the memories of their home. He threw himself into his work, the long hours helping to block out the emptiness that lurked in the background, but even as he tried to move forward, the bitterness lingered. She had chosen a stranger over the 10 years they'd shared. It was a wound that wouldn't heal overnight. Then one quiet evening, a message flashed on his phone from an unfamiliar number. He didn't need to look at it. "Gary, I'm sorry. Can we talk? I made a mistake." One message turned into a dozen, each more desperate than the last. She had finally realized what she'd lost, but for Gary it was far too late. The trust was broken beyond repair. Without a second thought, he blocked her number, refusing to let her words reopen the wound. He didn't want revenge and didn't need to see her suffer. All he wanted was to leave it behind. As weeks turned to months, he did just that. 6 months after he walked out for the last time, the divorce was finalized. He'd rebuilt his life, throwing himself into his career, exploring new hobbies and even starting to date again. The sting of betrayal had faded, leaving only a dull ache, a scar to remind him of what he'd survived. Slowly Gary moved forward, creating a life that was finally his own. It would take time for the scars to fade, but Gary had learned one vital truth. He was stronger than he'd ever realized. He'd survived the kind of betrayal that could have broken him. Yet he'd emerged on the other side, piecing himself back together, standing on the balcony of his new apartment, overlooking the city lights. He felt a quiet peace. The storm had finally passed, and while his heart was still healing, he was ready for whatever lay ahead. The months following his divorce had taught Gary a lot about himself. Healing was anything but straightforward. Some days he felt unstoppable, full of optimism. Other days the loneliness would creep in, reminding him of the weight of his loss. But each day, no matter how difficult, brought him one step closer to reclaiming himself. His new apartment, though small, had become his. He felt safe and supported in his new home, which he'd chosen with care and filled with personal touches. It was a space that reflected his evolving identity, and a freedom he hadn't realized he'd lost. One evening Gary came across an old list of hobbies he'd set aside before meeting Ruth. Painting had been a way for him to express himself, but life had taken over, and he'd let other commitments take priority. He'd set the brush down and hadn't picked it back up that night. He decided it was time to rediscover it. He found an old canvas tucked away in his closet, set it up in the center of his living room, and let his hands remember the strokes. The initial movements were clumsy. He wasn't very good at first, but he soon got into the swing of it. It wasn't about creating a masterpiece. It was about reconnecting with himself. The hours just flew by, and when he stepped back he looked at his work and felt a deep sense of calm. The painting wasn't perfect, but it was a part of him. Decay, chaos, pain, growth. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely at peace. Meanwhile, life hadn't been very kind to Ruth. She had imagined a new beginning with Vincent, convinced that this fresh chapter would bring her happiness. But reality had quickly shown her otherwise. That illusion, the thrill of secrecy, had faded. She saw Vincent clearly for the first time. The passion and excitement that had once masked his flaws were gone. She realized he wasn't the man she'd idealized. Their relationship was once full of spontaneity and romance. It was now strained and hollow. It was built on convenience rather than commitment. Vincent had become distant. He was uninterested in any kind of future together. Ruth found herself alone. She was grappling with the loneliness she hadn't anticipated. She missed Gary. She missed not just the security and stability he provided, but looking back she saw that the life they'd built together wasn't so bad. It had its mundane moments, but every relationship does. She'd been foolish to believe that chasing excitement with Vincent would magically solve her dissatisfaction. One night, after yet another argument with Vincent, she sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on all she'd lost. She thought of reaching out to Gary, hoping he'd give her a chance to explain, but the memory of her actions held her back. She'd crossed a line, and she knew she had to live with the consequences. As time went on, Gary's life took on a new meaning. He reconnected with old friends, people he hadn't spoken to in years, surrounded by familiar faces who had known him long before his marriage. He felt a renewed sense of belonging. They had stood by him through his hardest days, and now they celebrated his return to himself. One of these friends was Lisa, someone he'd known since high school, though they'd never been particularly close. Over the years, their paths crossed more often, as Gary began to re-enter the social world. Gary started to interact with people in his social circle again, initially just having coffee or catch-up, but over time, something deeper began to grow between him and Lisa. She was warm, understanding and, most importantly, patient. She understood what he'd been through and never pressured him to rush his healing. Their relationship unfolded slowly and naturally, without the intensity or turbulence he'd known before. With Lisa, there was no rush and no pressure to be anyone but himself. For the first time in years, Gary felt he could relax, let his guard down and just be. One evening, as they sat together on his balcony, gazing out over the city lights, Lisa turned to him, her hand resting gently on his. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. "You've been through so much, but you're still standing. That says everything about who you are." Her words stirred something in Gary. He didn't always feel strong, but hearing it from Lisa was more than just a new beginning. She was proof that healing was possible, and that he could find happiness again. Even after his life had come crashing down. While Gary was moving forward, Ruth was caught in her own unraveling. The relationship she'd sacrificed everything for had faded quickly. Vincent, the man she'd left her life with, had moved on without hesitation, leaving her alone to face the mess her choices had created. Every time she thought about calling Gary, regret stopped her. She knew she couldn't ask for forgiveness after all she'd done. She'd gambled a long relationship for something temporary, something that hadn't been worth the damage it caused. Now she found herself facing a loneliness she hadn't anticipated. Haunted by memories of the life she'd left behind, one evening, in a moment of weakness, Ruth found herself outside Gary's apartment. She hadn't meant to end up there, but something stronger than reason had brought her. She stood on the sidewalk, gazing up at his window, wondering if he was home, if he was happy, if he ever thought of her. But she couldn't bring herself to go in to knock or to even call him. Instead, she lingered, lost in her thoughts, before eventually turning away. She knew deep down it was far too late to undo what had been done. That same day, Gary let go of the last remnants of their shared history. He never saw Ruth standing outside, and he didn't need to. That chapter was firmly closed, and he was ready to move on. That night, Gary took out an old photo album. He and Ruth had filled it over the years with memories. As he flipped through the pages, he felt a mixture of sadness and acceptance. There had been wonderful moments, but they belonged to the past. He was done holding on to them. Something that no longer served him, he took a pair of scissors and began to cut up the photos. He wasn't angry, he was just saying goodbye. Each snip was a symbolic release, a final way to leave the past behind. When he finished, he gathered the pieces and placed them in a small box. He didn't feel the need to destroy them, they were part of his story, but they had no place in his present nor in the future. He was beginning to build as the weeks passed. Gary felt a growing sense of peace. He didn't dwell on what would happen with Lisa or what the future held. He was content for once to live in the present. One afternoon, while walking through the park with her, Gary paused, taking in the crisp autumn air and the warm sunlight on his face. He glanced over at Lisa, laughing at something he'd said, and felt a surge of gratitude. His past was behind him, and whatever the future held, it was his to shape. As the anniversary of his divorce approached, Gary thought back on his journey. It had been tough, but he'd learned a lot about himself. He'd discovered the importance of self-care. Setting boundaries and knowing when to let go were important lessons. The betrayal he had faced had hurt deeply, but it hadn't broken him. In fact, it had revealed his resilience. He had also learned that forgiveness didn't mean excusing someone's actions. It meant freeing himself from the weight of bitterness. He had forgiven Ruth, not to let her off the hook, but to release himself from anger. He no longer needed to carry a grudge. On his balcony, overlooking the city that had become his sanctuary, Gary felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The future lay open before him, and he was ready to embrace it. He had weathered the darkest of storms and was finally ready to step forward into the light. Subscribe to stay one step ahead of cheaters. Trust me, the next story will make this one look like a fairy tale.